So continuing today our series on misunderstood words, and I've chosen this one today, heresy. And it's worth saying at the outset, this is a churchy, theological word. And for much of our world, it seems that the setting in which this word is used is irrelevant. But what I want to say is that even though for many people the religious setting has passed them by, it still speaks to a tendency we all have, and it speaks to a problem that faces us, perhaps even more than it ever has. And so I think just from that perspective on its own, this word is worth thinking about and understanding. So the word heresy, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's not usually a very friendly, happy word, but it comes from the Greek, from this word, hieresis, the verb meaning to choose or to take for oneself. It means a self-chosen opinion, a religious or philosophical sect, discord or contention. Primarily refers to a group or faction that arises from a division or a choice, sometimes with a negative connotation of causing division or promoting false teachings. Now, if you go into a Bible concordance and look for the word heresy, you don't find it many times in the Bible. But if you go looking for the Greek word, you find it 9 times, and I just want to share that with you. First of all, and most commonly, it's used in the book of Acts to mean a sect, as in a group, a subset of a religious organisation. So, in Acts chapter 5, it's used to refer to the sect of the Sadducees. In chapters 15 and 26, it's used to refer to the sect of the Pharisees. And then in chapters 24 and 28, it's used to refer to the sect of the Nazarenes or Christianity within the context of the Jewish religion. But there's a couple of other references which are really worth having a look at. And the first one is Galatians chapter 5, where it's listed here as one of the works of the flesh. And notice, so it's listed amongst selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, and murders. And they are works of the flesh which are later contrasted with what's known as the fruits of the Spirit. And the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, and so on. You see the difference between the two lists. The idea of contention, dissension, envy in that first list. It's also referred to in the second book of Peter. But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. That's probably a usage that we're much more familiar with in terms of this word. But I note here that it's the only time in the New Testament it's used in this way. The final one that I wanted to refer to is in the first book of Corinthians, chapter 11. And I've quoted quite a long section here. Notice it's translated as factions in the middle of this text. Let me read it to you. Now, in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. Now think about the word heresy within that context. It's quite different from perhaps what you might expect. These factions are not doctrinal differences. They're not differences of understanding. These are differences of behaviour. These are regarding myself as better than somebody else, putting myself above somebody else. This is what Paul's referring to. And it's really useful to understand what Paul continues on to talk about as he moves through this. As you go through the rest of chapter 11, he actually recounts the story of the Lord's Supper. And it's believed to be the first written account of the Lord's Supper is in this chapter from Corinthians, because Paul wrote his letter to the Corinthians before they believed the Gospels themselves were written. So he goes on to talk about the Holy Supper. But then in chapter 12, he goes on to talk about what is known as the body of Christ, and talks about the way the whole body, though different, ought to be united. And then chapter 13 contains that very famous passage about love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Do you see what he's leading on to here? He's moving from division, a division caused by jealousies, by all sorts of things, onto unity, onto love and respect for one another. So we look at our modern world and we look at our church today with its tens of thousands of denominations, and I wonder what Paul would think of us. And then I wonder what Jesus would think of it all too. It's not a good picture, is it? So I want to now move on to what the teachings of the church say about heresy, about this term. So Swedenborg writes this: when a church is raised up by the Lord, it is faultless to begin with. In the course of time, however, charity faded and passed away. And as it passed away, evils took its place, and along with evils, falsities wormed their way in. From this, schisms and heresies resulted, which would never have existed if charity had continued to reign. He continues, in those days, as in the days when charity ruled, they would never even call it schism or heresy, but a matter of doctrine adhered to in accordance with the particular belief of that schism or heresy. That matter of doctrine they would leave to each individual's conscience, provided it did not deny anything fundamental, that is, the Lord, eternal life, or the Word, and provided it was not contrary to divine order, that is, the Ten Commandments. When we talk about division and disagreement in this way, it's a problem for the whole community. It's not just a problem for the individual with the dissenting opinion, although very often what happens is the individual is ostracized and pushed out. We need to understand that it is a problem for the whole to deal with. Disagreements do not have to separate us. Rather, I would contest that the principle of charity, as we understand it, means that we should not be divided from one another. We should remain united, a coherent whole. The thing that we need to push out is the tendency to separate, the tendency to divide. That's the thing that needs to be shunned and removed. And it's something we shun, all of us, from within ourselves. I've been unfortunate enough to be in the position to observe this dissension take place at times. And I note the tendency, often the person who has the dissension, the heresy, the different idea from everybody else, will ultimately remove themselves And I've seen that take place. They might go and set up another group or whatever else, or join somebody else who has more similar ideas to themselves. But I've also seen that same person return to realise their mistake, realise the contention, the difficulty that it's caused, and come back into the whole. So it doesn't need to permanently create a division, but we do need to be very careful about the way that we handle these as a community. So I would go so far as to say that the way that we allow space for and hold the possibility of disagreement and the discomfort that brings to us, the way we hold that defines our very being as a church. How comfortable are you with discomfort? It's a challenge we all must face. Because as I read the Lord's words, and we heard them read twice by Neville this morning in John chapter 15, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. This is my commandment, that you love one another. No commandment to agree. It's a commandment to love. Now I want to focus now down on a bit more on the individual. Here's another passage for you. Wherever a church exists, heresies arise in it as a consequence of people basing their thinking on one particular article of faith to which they attach supreme importance. When we focus the whole attention on any one matter, we make that more important than any other, especially so when delusion claims it as a discovery of our own. In that case, everything seemingly agrees with it and supports it, even to the extent of our being ready to swear to it, when in fact it is false. So this is very much a challenge to the individual rather than the whole community, although it might apply to the community itself as well. When do you ever seize on a particular idea and make it supremely important above everything else, every other consideration? If you ever find yourself doing that, it ought to ring alarm bells, because there is the beginning of heresy. Step back and think, what is the bigger picture? What's the bigger reality that I'm not seeing? Am I blinkered in my vision? I'd also suggest you start thinking about the spiritual principles involved, rather than the external focus on circumstances and competition between people. And this is where I bring in Saul and David. David was said to be wise, and because of his wisdom, Saul feared him. So Saul approaches the kingdom and being king in a natural sense, in the sense of, I am the king. Whereas David approaches the role somewhat differently. He approaches the idea somewhat differently. We read a few weeks ago about another interaction with Saul and David. Saul was seeking to kill David and he was on the hunt for him. Saul goes into a cave to relieve himself and David happens to be in there and just cuts off the corner of his garment. Do you remember it? To prove that he's been in there and he had Saul within his power, but he did not harm him. Do you remember why he didn't harm him? Because he was the king. He was the king. He was in a position of power and he represented the Lord and the Lord's ruling. So he did not harm Saul. Had the roles been reversed, Saul would have taken every opportunity to kill David. So we have here in the figures of Saul and David, the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit contrasted. If you go back to that Galatians 5 passage and have a look at those, you'll see the character of Saul and the character of David displayed there. We are called to the character of David, the spiritual principle. while that religious setting has passed us by, we no longer have the same religious determination in the world and in politics that once we do. Understand that that tendency towards division is as present with us as it ever was. And we're called to do something different to that. You know, we look at politics and we see the way people divide along political lines. And the media is particularly bad at it in terms of raising the animosity between people. See, the media sells its newspapers based on scandal and outrage, unfortunately. And that's what grabs our attention. We're called to live in a fundamentally different way. We're called to live in a way which allows you to have your views and me to have my views, and we get on and we live our lives together despite the differences of opinion. We learn to love one another despite different perspectives. And this is why I say this word heresy is so important for us to understand. The tendency it represents and refers to is still very present amongst us. So I just challenge you to think, if you ever find yourself divided against another person, just consider your own contribution to that dynamic and consider how you might change that situation. It's very easy for us to focus upon the other person and assume that they are in the wrong. But that's not necessarily the case. We often look at the other person and assume that they must take the first step of reconciliation. But that's not necessarily the case. Whether they're right or whether they're wrong, we have the power of reconciliation in our own hands. I just want to finish with quoting the Lord again from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, where he said, "If you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift." Now, we might be talking about another person, but one of the things we learn from the teachings of the church is brother represents charity. So it's when we have something against the principle of charity, whether that's reflected in another person or not, that's when we need to leave our gift, go and be reconciled to the principle, and then come back, because then our worship is true and sincere.